Hello and welcome to my channel. This is a second video on this topic, how to draw trees in charcoal. And the reason why I'm doing a second video is because the first one had some shortcomings. It was a little bit too fast for some people. They complained about too much of it being in time-lapse, not enough in real time. Some others complained about the background music, the lack of zoom, and of course the quality of the video varied quite a bit. So I wanted to fix some of these things, and I'm not making this video to replace the first one, but sort of to complement it. That's why I'm going to do a drawing of fewer trees. This time I'm only going to do a drawing of 6 trees, but I'm hoping to do much more of it in real time and to provide you with much better and more detailed explanations. Now, before I move on to the main part of the drawing process and show you how I did the drawing of these 6 trees, I just want to talk about some general things when it comes to drawing trees, whether you're using charcoal or any other medium. So, essentially, in my opinion, there are 3 things that you need to do in order to draw a nice looking tree or a realistic looking tree. The first thing is to draw the realistic looking overall shape or general shape. The second thing is to define the structure of the tree, and the third thing is to get a nice looking texture, realistic looking texture. So the first thing is the general shape. And when it comes to shape, most trees, as you can see, have some sort of tree trunk and then a canopy. And the thing is that these canopies vary quite a bit. Some of them are more round, like this one. Others are kind of more spread out, like this. That really depends on the shape of the tree and its branches and its larger boughs. And some other trees have a shape that is more like more conical. It's kind of tapering here at the top. Alright? So that's the first thing that you need to try to imitate in your drawing. That's the first thing that you need to try to show or explain to a viewer. And if you get that right, then it's going to be easier. The second thing that you need to do is you need to take that larger shape and break it into smaller segments. Because we're not just going to have this one large shape. We need to divide that shape into a number of smaller shapes. So I'm going to divide this tree into several shapes, and this canopy now consists of several different segments. And what that does, it kind of explains the shape and the structure of the tree to the viewer. And now the next thing that you need to do is to shade all of these parts of the tree so that the tree would appear to have more volume and depth. And depending on the light source, you're going to shade some parts of the tree a little bit more and others a little bit less. So you'll need to define the contrast between the light side and the shadow side. So, for example, regardless of where the light source is coming from, you're going to have some darker areas in this canopy. For example, here, here, here. Now, why do we have these darker areas? That's because the light source can't reach all parts of the canopy. And these parts of the canopy which are deeper inside and closer to the boughs and the tree trunk, they're going to be darker because they're further away from the light source and they're in the shadow. While these parts of the canopy, which are sticking out, are closer to the light source, they're exposed to the light source, and they're going to be lighter. Now, depending on the light source, maybe it's coming from this side. One side of the tree is going to be lighter, and the other side of the tree is going to be darker. And you're going to shade the tree trunk and the canopy in such a manner to reflect the direction of the light source. But you also have to shade these individual segments so that they reflect the direction of the light source. So that's the second thing. The third thing that you need to try to get right is the texture. The texture is the small detail, the appearance of the surface of objects. And basically that's what the tree looks like to us when we're looking at it from a distance. So a tree trunk, for example, has its texture because it has these cracks in its tree bark, so you need to try to imitate that. And the canopy has foliage, it has a whole bunch of leaves, so you need to try to imitate that, and you need to try to draw something that looks like a whole bunch of foliage. Now the good thing for you is that a charcoal pencil, which is very soft, will tend to produce a lot of texture when you put it down on the paper. You see, you're already producing something that kind of looks like a bunch of leaves, that kind of looks like texture. And you can use that texture to your advantage. You can modify it, you can soften it a little bit with your blending tools, you can emphasize some details using your erasers and things like that. And you can use all of these tools to create a nice realistic looking texture that will kind of trick the eye of the viewer that they're looking at something really detailed that really looks like a bunch of trees. Of course, the texture of the canopy will depend on what type of tree we're looking at, the type of its leaves, or whether it's leaves or needles, whether the leaves are larger or smaller, the shape of the leaves and things like that. So you need to try to imitate that to a certain degree. Now let's get on to the main part of the drawing process. So I'm going to start with the first tree. Like I said, I'm using these Kohinoor Gioconda pencils. And the first tree is going to be a linden tree. I have to keep my pencils sharp for the most of the drawing process. And I'm going to start with the tree trunk, and then I'm going to do the canopy. As I examined some of the reference photos of these trees, I saw that most of them don't have a round shape, but the shape is often more elongated at the top, and it's kind of pear-shaped in most cases. So that's the shape I'm going for here. And notice that I'm also wiggling the pencil a little bit, trying to create an irregular line, jagged line for this outer shape, where I'm allowing my hand to make the pencil wiggle a little bit. That's because I'm trying to imitate the outer shape of the canopy, which consists of a lot of leaves. That's why it has such an irregular shape. Now once I finish with the sketch, and once I'm happy with the way it looks, I can start shading. And I'm going to do that with a softer charcoal pencil. The tree trunk is usually a little bit darker in that area just under the canopy, because the canopy is casting a shadow onto the tree trunk. So there are several ways you can approach this. You can either draw the shadow areas first, or you can maybe draw some indications of branches, try to define the structure of the tree, or you can shade the entire tree and then define the lighter and the darker shade areas later. I'm going to use a combination of these approaches, but I'm mostly going to put some indications of darker areas, of shadow areas first. The light source is usually coming from above, from the sky, from the sun, but in most cases it's coming more from one side than the other. In this case, it's going to be coming more from the left than the right. So the left side is going to be a little bit lighter, and the right side is going to be a bit darker with some more of those shadow areas. And I'm going to use the same light source for the trees in the upper row, and for the trees in the lower row or the bottom row, I'm going to use a light source which is coming from the opposite direction. And now I'm shading the main part of the canopy, or the larger part of the canopy. And I'm doing that by dragging my pencil over the over the body of the canopy and allowing it to produce a nice looking texture. How am I doing this? I'm keeping my pencil strokes really short. I'm either using a circular motion or a short back and forth motion, but the key word is short. You have to keep your pencil strokes really short, because if you don't, you're going to end up with long parallel lines that don't really resemble foliage at all. But if you're patient and if you allow your pencil to create this texture that consists of really short strokes, it's going to look like a bunch of leaves as seen from a distance. Now the next step is to do a bit of blending, so I go over that with a brush. And as I'm going over with a brush, you can see how it's starting to look a lot better. First of all, it's getting a little bit darker, but that's okay. I want it to be a bit darker. But also the canopy is starting to appear a little more dense, like there's more leaves in there, and the texture is starting to appear a bit softer. This is what I wanted to achieve, because when you're drawing things like this, it's the same thing when you're drawing grass or hair or feathers or anything that's kind of complex, it has a complex texture. You can't draw every single leaf, just like you can't draw every single blade of grass. So you need to try to find a way to produce an illusion that will trick the eye, like you drew a lot of leaves. And this texture in combination with the blending tools will produce that feeling of volume, like you're looking at a lot of leaves. So I resharpen my pencil, and now that I shaded the larger part of the tree and established some kind of a base tone with some of the darker areas, I'm going to go even further and try to define some more of these shadow areas, dividing the canopy into smaller segments. So this is the part that I was talking about in the intro, where I said that you can't just leave a canopy as a single object. You have to divide it into smaller shapes, and this is what I'm going to be doing now. I'm going to be putting in some of these darker areas or shadow areas in between these clusters of leaves, and these clusters of leaves form around the larger branches, and that is what makes the structure of a tree. Now you don't really have to force this, or you don't really have to force yourself to make it similar to the reference photo. You kind of just have to let it happen and put these shadow areas kind of randomly wherever it feels right to you, just dividing the tree into smaller segments. You can always go back and refine these a little bit later. Just keep in mind that you should roughly stick to the to your light source, which in this case is coming from above and from the left. So we know that our right side is going to be a bit darker, so we're going to have a bit more of those shadow areas on the right. And we also know that under each and every one of those clusters there's going to be more shadow. And I'm doing the same thing with my pencil as I'm drawing in these shadow areas that I did when I was shading the main part of the canopy. I'm kind of allowing my hand to produce this irregular wiggling motion and using short strokes so that I can produce a certain texture. And that way I won't have to do a lot of work later. I also use my tortillon to refine the edge of the tree a little bit, creating some indications of smaller leaves or groups of leaves around the outer edge of the tree. This is very important because these smaller bits, smaller leaves that seem kind of detached from the main body of the tree, they make the tree look a lot more realistic, because the viewer's imagination can fill in these gaps, because these smaller leaves are connected with smaller branches and twigs which are barely visible, or which are not visible at all from a distance, which is why the viewer can fill that in kind of for themselves. And now I'm using a pencil eraser to erase some of the lighter portions of the canopy Basically, I'm drawing some of the lighter leaves or clusters of leaves, because some parts of that canopy are sticking out. They're sticking out, they're protruding, and they're closer to the light source, and they're getting more light from the light source, and that's why they are lighter. But at the same time, I'm trying to keep these white dots or lighter dots smaller, so that it will resemble the appearance of a linden tree, which has a lot of these smaller leaves and flowers. So I kind of want to create something that looks like a linden tree from a distance. Of course, you can't get it to look perfect. I mean, there is only so much you can do with your pencils and with your erasers. These are not super precise, super accurate tools. But what you can do is kind of simplify and approximate so that you create something that has a similar texture to the tree that you're trying to draw. But of course, what's even more important than the texture and then those smaller details are the larger contrasts. Because if you fail to capture or convey those larger contrasts, then your tree will not look very realistic. It will not look like an object that has volume and depth. So it's very important to define those shadow areas, and it's very important to have that contrast between the larger areas of shadow and the lighter areas which are closer to the light source. So as we're looking at this tree now, we can feel like it has a three-dimensional irregular shape, like that there are some shadow areas which are deeper inside the canopy and they are darker, and there are some lighter parts of the canopy which are sticking out. Some of the branches and the leaves growing on them is sticking out and getting more light from the light source. So I am pretty much wrapping things up with this drawing of the linden tree, just putting down some of the finishing touches and maybe putting in some of the darker details here and there, some of the lighter details or highlights here and there, and kind of wrapping things up. Sometimes I also like to drag my pencil a little bit, adding some random texture here and there, and once I clean it up, I'm going to be ready to move on to the second tree. So, the second tree is going to be a little bit different in terms of shape. The first one was a deciduous tree, and now I'm going to draw an evergreen tree or a coniferous tree. It's going to be a kind of a fir. So I'm going to draw a fir tree, and a fir tree naturally has a shape that is considerably different than the first tree. Its structure and its smaller details are also completely different, because it doesn't have these clusters of leaves. Its branches are of different shape, they grow differently, and also it has clusters of needles rather than clusters of leaves. So this is a completely different looking tree, and I'm going to try to draw a shape that looks like that fir tree. Here I started with a slightly different approach. I kind of first defined the lower portion of the tree, how wide the base will be, and then I defined the top so that I could give myself an idea of how tall I want the tree to be. But the thing is that I didn't really draw the outline in the same way that I did with the first tree. Here I drew some indications of some of these branches which are sticking out to the side. So this tree has a conical shape, or mostly a conical shape, with these layers of branches which are kind of getting shorter and shorter near the top. So the tree tapers near the top because these younger, newer branches at the top are shorter. The older branches at the bottom are more massive and they're longer. And another interesting thing is that the shorter branches tend to point more upwards, while the longer branches are kind of growing out to the side and even drooping downwards at the bottom. And I don't want much of the tree trunk to be visible here. I want a really thick canopy which kind of grows all the way to the bottom of the tree. With the first tree, if you've been paying attention, I've used a combination of charcoal pencils and erasers. And as for the erasers, in case I haven't mentioned, I used a Kohinoor pencil eraser and a Faber-Castell kneaded eraser. But the erasers, even though I used them for cleaning up when I finished with the first tree, they are mostly drawing tools. You mostly use them for drawing highlights, for drawing lighter shapes and lighter lines, rather than just correcting tools or erasing tools. So our erasers are basically used as white pencils, if you will. They are used for drawing lighter shapes. Now with this tree, because the canopy is a little bit darker and the structure is a little bit more complex, I'm not going to use the erasers quite as much as I did with the first tree. I'm going to try to achieve those highlights in a slightly different way, even though eventually I will have to use erasers at least a little bit so that I can define some parts of that canopy which are getting more light. But the shape of the tree is considerably different, and the shape and the structure of these clusters of needles is different. So I'm mostly going to try to focus on the outer shape and the overall shape of the fir tree, trying to create first and foremost a realistic looking shape that resembles a fir tree, and also trying to create realistic looking details, especially around the tip of those branches, or the end of those branches. And if I can do that, I'm going to end up with a realistic looking fir tree. I'm using a tortillon again to soften some of those lines and to give that tree more volume, because I can't draw every single needle, just like I can't draw every single leaf. So using blending tools is my way of adding more volume and density to everything so that it appears more realistic. Now I'm doing the same thing that I did with the previous tree. I'm trying to define some of the shadow areas in between these larger branches and clusters of needles. And these shadow areas are usually the areas which are just under these larger branches and closer to the tree trunk. So I'm using the same thing, using the same approach, keeping my strokes short, but this time I'm using more of a back and forth motion because I want to imitate the appearance of the tree. And I'm also using a brush a bit. Now, as you're pulling your strokes, whether you're using a circular motion or an elliptical motion or a back and forth motion, it's a good idea to vary the direction of your strokes just a little bit, because you don't want to make it too uniform. You want to create as much randomness as you can, so that the whole tree would look a lot realistic. That's the way you get a more realistic looking texture. And here, as you can see, I used my pencil eraser to create some indications of lighter areas, because this conical shape is getting light from above, and these tiers or layers of branches which are kind of stacked on one on top of the other, they are always casting a shadow, a little bit of shadow under them onto the next tier, and you want to make some parts of these branches or clusters of needles which are sticking out, which are further away from the tree trunk and further away from that shadow area. You want to make that a bit lighter, and that's why I had to use my pencil eraser to pull some of those highlights. So it doesn't have to look perfect. You can't really define it as well as it's defined in your reference photo. Obviously it's not going to be quite that detailed, but like I said, you can always go for a nice looking texture and try to create a realistic looking texture with an illusion of detail to entertain the eye of the viewer. I'm using a pencil, kneaded eraser to dab on some of the lighter areas a bit, taking away a bit of the value, and I'm also using a charcoal pencil to refine some of the shadow areas which in some places I felt weren't big enough, or maybe they weren't dark enough, or maybe I felt like there wasn't enough contrast. So here I'm also putting down some of the finishing touches, trying to make this thing look as realistic and as complex as I can make it. Once again, I'm doing this video as a combination of real-time footage and some time-lapse, but this time I'm going to do a lot more in real time, and I'm hoping that it'll be enough for you to be able to follow along. If you want even longer videos with even more narration and explanations, then you should check out my Patreon, because I have full-length and real-time videos there. But here on YouTube I mostly post slightly shorter videos, even though I feel like most of my videos are long enough for you to be able to understand what's going on and the techniques that I'm using. Just refining some of the shadow areas and putting down some of the finishing touches. So far we've done 2 trees. I hope you like their appearance, because the third one is going to be something completely different. So we're moving on to the third tree, and this tree is going to have a completely different shape, completely different structure. This is going to be a palm tree. And I started by drawing the tree trunk first. And I wanted it to kind of bend in one direction, to lean over in one direction, but I initially wasn't really happy with the angle, with how much it was leaning to one side. So I wanted to make it lean over a little bit more. I wanted to make it lean even more to the right side. And by the way, my light source is on the left, so the right side is going to be a bit darker, just like with the previous trees. Sometimes this difference is barely noticeable, because what's mostly noticeable is that the light source is coming from above, but the light source is coming more from the left than the right in this case. I'm also drawing some indications of these larger leaves of a palm tree. I just drew those lines to give myself an idea where these shapes will be, and I also made the tree trunk a bit lighter, defining the right edge a little bit more so that it's a little bit darker because of the light source, and drawing a bit of shadow on the right because the tree is casting a shadow to the right. And then I started to draw these large leaves, which kind of have a complex structure, because it's like they consist of these smaller leaves. So I'm not really sure, I'm not an expert on the shape or the anatomy of these palm trees, but I'm just going to treat these shapes as leaves, large huge leaves. And first I'm going to draw them a little bit darker. So at first they're going to seem a little bit too dark, but then I'm going to add some lighter areas using erasers. But right now I want to make them a little bit darker, because this is making it easier for me to draw their shape. And of course this central area where the leaves meet and where they join the rest of the tree trunk, that's going to be the darkest because that's where the least amount of light is coming through. And the leaves on the outer edge of the tree are going to be a bit lighter. Now, as I go over this with a brush, as usual, the brush is really creating a lot more realistic looking appearance of these leaves because it's softening that texture, it's making everything look a bit more dense, like I've spent a lot more time working on that. So it's all about creating an illusion of detail without actually putting in all that work to draw every single detail. A bit more shadow on the part of the tree trunk just under the canopy because that's where there is most shadow. And of course I use a pencil eraser to draw some indications of lighter areas on those large leaves, drawing some highlights around the middle of those leaves, and then going over the top part of the leaves and just randomly taking away a bit of value to make those parts of the leaves which are sticking out from the canopy a little bit lighter, so that I could make everything look a bit more three-dimensional and so that I can create more depth in those darker shadow areas. So just a little bit of refining and just a little bit of cleaning up, and the palm tree is done. So far I think this was the simplest one in terms of its shape and structure, and now I'm going to move on to the fourth tree, and this one is going to be different, again different than all the other ones. I'm going to do a drawing of a tree that's that also has a kind of a conical shape, but this one looks a little bit more almost like a candle, and it's going to be a cypress tree. This is also an evergreen tree, and like I said, it almost looks like a flame on a candle. But of course I'm going to make its outer edge a little bit more irregular than that. I do want it to look like an actual tree. For these lower trees, the trees in the lower part of the paper, I'm going to use a different light source. The light source here is going to be coming from the right, so from the opposite direction, but it's still mainly coming from above. So the shadows are going to be cast downwards, but also to the left. Now the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to draw the outer shape, trying to imitate the shape of a cypress tree and drawing this irregular outline. Then I'm going to shade the main part of the canopy, and then once I've established a base tone, I'm going to define the shadow areas and the lighter areas, not necessarily in that order. But as I'm establishing the base tone or the base value, I'm also creating some texture. But notice how my strokes here were a little bit longer, because I kind of wanted to imitate the direction in which these branches grow and also their length a little bit. So I changed the type of my stroke so that the texture would be a bit different. Now when you use your blending tools, they do make everything a little bit darker and they do remove some of the texture, but you can see that some of the texture still remains. I didn't remove all of it. So you can control how much texture you leave when you use your blending tools. I'm using a tortillion here again, and these are homemade tortillions. I roll them myself, so if you want to see how that is done, you can find that in my videos. And now I'm using a pencil eraser to draw some lighter portions or highlights on the tree. So if the light is coming from the right, we're going to have some parts of the tree on the right catching light from above. And you can see how I created some indications of lighter parts of that canopy. And after I do that, I add a bit more shadow on the tree trunk. I add a bit of shadow which is coming from the tree on the left, and then I start going in, defining some of the shadow areas in the tree, kind of adding a little more depth and volume to this canopy. I'm going in between these lighter areas as well as working in the shadow area of the tree. So I'm kind of hoping that this range of value will create a realistic looking tree that's popping out of the paper and that appears to have volume. While I'm doing this, I'm also adding a bit more texture to the tree, so the whole canopy is starting to look a lot more complex. But that's not my main goal. My main goal, of course, is establishing contrast between the lighter areas and the shadow areas. The texture that I'm producing is just a side effect, but it is a side effect that is very welcome because I want the texture of the tree to appear a lot more complex. I'm also going to use a kneaded eraser to do some refining in these lighter areas of the canopy. And the tree, as you can see, is almost finished. I feel like the first two trees were quite a bit more complex than the other two. The palm tree was probably the simplest one. This one was a little bit more complex, but still went very smoothly, I think, and was done pretty quickly. My video here on YouTube is going to be about an hour long. If you're wondering how long the entire process was in real time, I'm not really sure. I think it was close to 2 hours. So as I've already explained, I will play some of this in time-lapse, but some of it is also in real time. Moving on to the fifth tree. This one is going to be an oak. I often draw oaks when I do tutorials on how to draw trees. But this time I'm going to draw a slightly different oak because the canopy is not going to be quite as dense as in some other cases. And that's why I'm first trying to define some of the branches, some of the structure and the shape of the branches. Because it's easier to draw a tree when you just have a canopy and not many branches visible. Here I'm kind of making one of the branches twist in front of the tree trunk and twist away to the left side, so we're going to try to make the system of branches a lot more interesting and complex than is the case with other trees. So I'm drawing these branches which are kind of growing out to the sides, and when you're drawing branches you need to try to allow your hand to wiggle a little bit so that you can produce that irregular shape. But you also have to remember that branches need to taper as they grow out, so they're thicker near the base where they join where they grow out of the tree trunk. I'm drawing a bit of the canopy, making some suggestions of some larger clusters of leaves. But you can see that this canopy looks a little bit different than the first tree. This is also a deciduous tree, but the canopy is more spread out, and it's also less dense, and more of the branches are visible. I decided to modify the shape of the canopy a little bit, and now I'm going to start drawing some foliage. So you can see that my approach to drawing trees kind of varies depending on the structure of the tree. Sometimes, if the canopy is simpler, I could just draw the outline of the canopy and start shading it. Sometimes when the structure is a little bit more complex and more of the branches are visible, then I can first try to define some of the branches, and then I start drawing some parts of the canopy. But my approach to creating this foliage here is very similar, so very, very short strokes in order to produce a realistic looking texture. But this time there will be a lot of space in between these clusters, and here I'm shading the tree trunk again, adding some shadow under that foliage. Now, because some parts of the canopy are in front of the branches, some of the branches and some of the tree trunk is going to be obscured by that foliage, so I want to draw interrupted shape of these branches and interrupted shape of a tree trunk, where in some places, like I said, the tree trunk is obscured or hidden behind all that foliage. Now, wherever there is a little bit more shadow on the tree trunk, I make that part a little bit darker. And I also want some of these branches kind of twisting and overlapping and bending every which way. And I can also use a Tortillion to dab on these marks that I created with a charcoal pencil, and that'll kind of soften these marks and make the foliage look a bit more realistic and of course more dense. So that's what I started doing, but then I decided to do a little bit more work on some other parts of the canopy. So you can choose how you want to approach this, but generally, like I said, when I have a tree with a complex structure of branches like this, I want to try to at least make some suggestions of where the branches will go during the sketch phase, and then I start putting in some foliage using that scribbling motion with my charcoal pencil. Now, I know some people will ask if you can do the same thing with a graphite pencil. The answer is of course yes, but I have to tell you this would be a bit more difficult with a graphite pencil because the graphite doesn't get quite as dark even when you use a bit more pressure. The thing about charcoal is that you can produce some areas of darker value without actually using any pressure, or with using very little pressure. With graphite, the whole thing would be a lot lighter. You would have to use several different grades of graphite pencils, and getting those darker tones would be a lot slower and a lot more difficult. But basically my approach here was to draw some of the branches in the canopy first, making that darker because it's in the shadow, and because a lot of these clusters of leaves are casting a shadow onto those parts of the branches in the tree trunk. And then after I've defined that kind of a net consisting of overlapping branches, then I started putting in these clusters of leaves. And of course, while I'm doing this, while I'm creating these small motions, small marks with my pencil, if there are some white spaces left between, if I want a more dense or a denser canopy, I can use a Tortillion to fill that in, or I can maybe leave some of those spaces in between to make the canopy look more complex and make it look like more of the sky is visible from behind, or like maybe some light is coming from behind that canopy, from behind that foliage. But as you can see, I first did that work with a charcoal pencil, and after that I proceeded to dab on that using a Tortillion. And the way I did that was pretty much imitating the motion of the charcoal pencil, so keeping those short strokes and just dabbing, trying to imitate the appearance of foliage, or at least those clusters of leaves, and maybe some individual flyaway leaves here and there. And This process did require a little bit of patience and a bit of time, but eventually it pays off because you end up with something that looks like a realistic looking tree, a realistic looking canopy. I think that out of all these trees that I've done, and like I said, there's going to be 6 trees here, I think this oak tree was probably the most complex one and probably took the largest amount of time. That and the linden tree probably took half the time that I needed to complete this whole drawing process of all of these trees. So the others was somewhat simpler, I think, mostly because of their shape and structure and because of the texture. The texture and the structure here is a little bit more complicated, so I need to take the time to try to render something that will look like a realistic looking canopy, that will look like a realistic canopy to the viewer. Now at this stage I kind of tried making some indications of lighter portions using a pencil eraser, but I realized that my canopy simply wasn't dark enough and I didn't have enough of those shadow areas. So I went over the whole thing and started adding some more value. And you can see how I also erased a little bit for that branch in the middle, going over the middle of the tree trunk so that it looks like it's in front of the tree trunk. Naturally here the left side of the tree is also darker, like the cypress tree next to it. So like I said, I'm going to have a slightly different source for the bottom 3 trees. And I kept working with a combination of an eraser and charcoal pencils until I was happy with the appearance of the canopy. But like I said, at one point I wasn't really happy with how dark some of the shadow areas were, and I wasn't really happy how many of those shadow areas there were. And if those areas aren't dark enough, or if you don't have enough of them, then you can't really create depth in your tree. It'll look kind of flat. So I thought that it still looked a little bit flat. So I started adding a bit more value in some areas to suggest that there is a bit more shadow there. And as I was adding those darker bits, those darker patches of foliage, I thought that my tree started to look better. The contrast and the range of value started to give my tree a bit more volume and depth. So it's very important to have that range of value, and it's very important to define a strong contrast between the light side and the shadow side, and the lighter portions of the canopy and the shadow portions or darker portions of the canopy. Because if you don't do that, the canopy will end up looking flat. This way you can have a nice, almost 3-dimensional looking canopy. So when a viewer looks at that canopy, they can almost feel like some of those clusters of leaves are kind of protruding towards them, that they're closer to them, while others are further behind them and deeper in the canopy, and that's why they're in the shadow. So I think that's a fairly detailed looking oak tree, and I'm going to leave it at that and move on to the next tree. Now this one is also going to have an elongated shape, kind of similar to the one on the left, but it's not going to be tapering quite as much. I want to do a drawing of a poplar here, and they also grow very tall and have almost like a cylindrical shape. But as these branches grow upwards, they fan out just a little bit, and that's why I made some indications of those branches where some of those branches will be visible. So the rest of it is mostly going to be foliage, but I don't want all of the branches to be obscured. by the foliage, I want the viewer to be able to see at least some part of those of that structure of those branches, so that they can understand how the leaves grow and how these branches grow out. So that was my outer shape of a poplar, and I was pretty happy with the way it came out. Very irregular, very random, and that was the beginning. That's what I had to start from. I shaded the tree trunk a little bit, making the left side a little bit darker, like I did with the oak tree, and then I started working on the texture and the base value of the tree, again using very short, small marks with my charcoal pencil. So in this phase, like with many of the previous trees, I'm doing two things at the same time. I'm shading the tree by establishing some of the base tones, but at the same time I'm trying to produce a bit of texture that will remain even once I use blending tools over it. And while I did that, I also tried to make some indications of shadow areas, but I decided maybe I should do that later. So I shaded the whole tree and then went over it with a brush. And the good thing about brushes is that even when you go over those marks with a brush, the texture still remains. It becomes a little bit softer, it becomes a little bit darker, you fill in a lot of those white spaces, but a lot of that texture is still there, it's still visible. And that's kind of what I wanted to achieve. I drew some holes in that canopy so that I could make it look like light is coming through, that canopy is not obscuring the view to the sky behind it. And then I used a charcoal pencil to make some indications of shadow areas and to basically break that canopy into smaller parts, like I did with all the other trees. So I have a larger shape, and now I'm using some darker values to indicate shadow areas between smaller shapes. Basically, I'm dividing the tree into some smaller parts, smaller shapes. And you don't have to stick to your reference photo when you're doing this. You can just go with the flow, see what works, kind of let it happen naturally. When you recognize that, for example, you can separate a segment or a cluster of leaves, you just put a little bit of darker value in there, and then you can go back and refine that a little bit with a pencil eraser, take away a little bit of value. And by now I think I've already explained my approach. So we're just going to finish this tree because it has a slightly different shape. But I also want a lot of these small leaves on the edges of the tree's outline, because that looks very realistic, like there are a lot of smaller branches and twigs, and these smaller leaves are kind of flying to the side. And here I used my erasers. I had to resharpen the pencil eraser for some of the smaller details, and then I tried pulling some of the lighter details to define those parts of the canopy which are sticking out and which are getting more light from above. And notice that here again the right side is a bit lighter than the left side, so the left side is my shadow side again. And where I felt that I didn't really like the texture, I just dabbed on it a little bit with a tortillon. And in those areas where I felt I needed to take away a little bit more of the value, I simply used an eraser. And whenever I would go over a segment with an eraser, that segment would start to pop out against the background. It would start to feel like it's protruding, or it's a little bit closer to the viewer. I also added some indications of branches using my pencil. And basically once I was happy with the amount of contrast between those lighter clusters of leaves and those darker ones, I started putting down some finishing touches and refining the texture a little bit. So I'm just doing some final cleaning up. That was my drawing process of these 6 trees. I'm just gonna remove this tape and spray it with some fixative, because it is charcoal, so I want to spray it with some fixative to fix it and also to see what it looks like. I made some minor corrections to the shape of this fir tree, but I'm mostly happy with the way the trees came out. They're not super detailed, but they look pretty detailed, and I didn't even spend that much time working on them. I think I created some realistic looking shapes and textures. But anyway, this is what it looks like when I spray it with a bit of fixative. I hope you enjoyed this video and you found some of it useful. Thank you for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.